Hello and welcome to the Intentional Clinician Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Krause, licensed professional counselor. If you are interested in ADHD in any way or have been afflicted by a ADHD diagnosis or a similar processing disorder, this podcast is for you. I'm going to interview Dr. Connie McReynolds, who has over 3 decades of experience as a distinguished psychologist and certified rehabilitation counselor. She is amazing, and she's written a book and helped people all over the world to work on navigating ADHD, anxiety, trauma, and other psychological challenges. Her approach is unique, though, as she actually tries to figure out what is going on with the ADHD. What is the root cause? Is it ADHD? Is it behavioral? Are there auditory or visual processing disorders going on? And most of all, her treatment is empirically backed with evidence, and she is working towards finding solutions and not really focusing on the negatives, but more about the solutions for anyone suffering from ADHD or related disorders. I was quite impressed with the data, the research, and her approach. For anyone who's interested, stay tuned for the interview. Hello, and welcome to the podcast, Dr. Connie McReynolds. It's such a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here today.
Yes, of course, and I'm glad that we'll be speaking about your new book, Solving the ADHD Riddle, The Real Cause and Lasting Solutions to Your Child's Struggle to Learn. And I will tell you, I actually did read the entire book. So the only thing I really didn't get into is the appendices, but I read the entire book, so I'm excited to ask you about it.
Okay.
And I would love to know kind of what your motivations were in writing this book. What kind of tipped this off for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, there were several things that really kind of propelled me. One is that I really have been doing this work for about 30 some years. And with that, I've had a lot of experiences with children and with adults with a lot of learning difficulties, different kinds of disabilities as such. And then over the last 16 years, I was running my neurofeedback clinics here in Southern California. And what we were discovering is that there actually are these underlying causal factors to ADHD that haven't really, had never really been discussed. I looked in the literature. I did a 2-year lit search before I published my first article on this back in 2018 to really understand, is someone else identifying this? So way back to my childhood, my mother taught second grade for 32 years in the same classroom. And so I kind of joke about growing up in second grade where I heard the stories of some of the children. And one of the children, actually, as I was writing the book, I found this memory kind of surfacing again with my mother and one of the little boys who couldn't read. And she was really concerned about him. And so over the summer, she took him to the local university, which local for us in those days was 45 miles away. So it was quite a drive, but we went every day for the summer period. And the folks at the University Teaching Center had discovered that he had something at that time called dyslexia, which most people didn't know anything about. And they helped him learn how to read. And as I was writing my book, I was reflecting back on that story and the influence of that I think had been residing within me for probably a very long time. And when I first started the clinic, my institute at this university, one of my colleagues came to me and said, hey, you need to look into this thing called neurofeedback. We're doing this in a school where children are struggling to learn, and we're helping them learn how to read. And so I thought, gosh, we need to check this out. And so we started down that journey, and lo and behold, it really was working. And we found that we had a lot of good success with it. And then when the pandemic hit and the clinics got shut down out here in California, we pivoted, and I contacted the software developer, and I said, we need a way to help people through this process, and they can't come to some of my clinics. They can't drive in right now. So they created a process so that we can work with people wherever they sit. And once I had that and we had tested it and it worked, I thought, okay, it's time to get this out to the general population so that they know that there are some solutions. There's some options to ADHD. There's some hope, really. in all the process.
Yes, that is very excellent to know that. And it's interesting because in the book, you talk about ADHD, but you also discuss at length the idea that a lot of other disorders get diagnosed as ADHD by clinicians that are trying to do the right thing. So some of those are auditory processing disorders, visual processing disorders, different behavioral disorders, learning disorders, sensory issues, Tourette's, some autistic type behaviors that maybe aren't actually that meet the diagnosis of autism, intellectual cognitive delays, tics, all sorts of things that actually in a Venn diagram probably meet some of the criteria for ADHD, but perhaps might explain the symptoms better. And so I was curious. Part of me saw that I felt like your approach was like, okay, well, let's just get everybody in neurofeedback and then do other things and see what happens. And you were kind of getting almost the same results. Because part of me was wondering about differential diagnosis and how do you know which is which? And you take these, you go over the this test you have people take, but the test is more not about diagnosis. The test seems to be about focused attention, sustained attention, selective attention, alternating attention, divided attention. So I guess I don't have a question yet, but my question is sort of this.
Okay.
I feel like right now the culture is obsessed with, do I have ADHD? Do I not have ADHD? This is what I hear from adults all the time. I think I have ADHD. It used to be bipolar. Now everyone thinks they have ADHD. What are your thoughts about needing to know about the diagnosis? What's your kind of philosophy on that?
Well, I think it's kind of an age-old situation. I've been in the field for 30 plus years, and sometimes a diagnosis and label can really help people. It's like, oh, okay. So let's say we've got anxiety and they never really knew that that's what it was called, but they knew they struggled. And sometimes just that piece of information can be very helpful. Other times people get stuck with that. And it's like they become over-identified, I would say, with kind of what that means. So with ADHD, when the DSM-5 came out, a decade or so ago, there was a lot of discussion about the criteria change for ADHD, and I think there was quite a bit of controversy around it. And I still think there's some of that going on, because when we read it, people will say, well, I qualify for that. Well, I qualify for that. Well, I meet the diagnostic criteria for that. So it's almost like too many people are feeling like they have ADHD. I think, yes, people have attention problems. I think there are a lot of reasons why. One of which is we are cultivating short attention spans in our culture. And we've been cultivating it for the better part of a decade or two. And so because people have capability of handling 40 character thoughts instead of a 20-minute in-depth discussion, people think they don't have attention spans. Well, they don't. They don't have attention spans, but it may not be due to an underlying diagnostic condition. They could benefit from tuning that up by far. And that's really where we're going. We actually look at what are these underlying root causes across all of these labels. I've had children come in with 5 different diagnoses on 3 different psychotropic medications under the age of 15. And they're kind of medicated out of their mind. Their parents are complaining that their child has changed. They look like a zombie, act like a zombie. It doesn't mean everyone's experiencing that, but the folks who come to my clinics are coming, the parents are coming because something else hasn't worked. They've tried other things, or they don't want to try these other things. They want to get to what we call the root cause. And when children come in diagnosed with bipolar condition and they're 10 years old, oppositional defiant disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, anxiety disorder, go down the list. These are 10-year-old children. I've had 5-year-olds diagnosed with some of these conditions. And it just kind of makes my head spin a little bit, because I'm thinking, first of all, you have a 5-year-old child. We don't even know what's going on here. We don't know what the family dynamics are. We don't know how the child's interacting with their environment. Let's figure some of this out first. And when we use this 20-minute computer-based assessment, we're looking at 37 areas of how the brain works with auditory and visual information. We also have 9 shorter assessments that we do that I didn't really talk too much about in the book because I was really focused on this other aspect, but we also look at some memory, conceptualization, and sequencing. And with those assessments that take less than an hour to do, we're able to dial in on what's working in people's brains and what isn't. Here are your strengths. You have a Ferrari up there, but it's just not in all the right gears yet. So let's fix that. Let's get you lined up so you can actually demonstrate what you're truly capable of doing. And one of the underlying problematic aspects of all of these conditions, but particularly when we're dealing with any kind of processing problem, is children and adults will naturally default to one place, which is I must not be smart enough to be able to do what people are asking me to do, because I look around me and if I'm in a classroom, I see my peers in my grade school doing the things that I can't figure out how to do. And when that happens to children and when it's going on with adults, this gets hardwired into their brain that it's something about intelligence or that they're delayed in some way. And we have a lot of folks that kind of go along with that diagnosis because they look delayed. So there's evidence for this on the surface that this is what's happening. So children can get channeled in, adults can get channeled into these diagnostic criteria that when we peel all of this back and we find out you don't have auditory memory, there's nothing wrong with your intelligence here. You just can't remember what anyone's saying to you. Well, you don't look very bright if you have to keep asking someone to repeat what they're saying, because people are going to perceive that as you are mentally slow. And at least in this world, mental slowness means I'm intellectually limited. And the two are not necessarily the same thing. Processing and intelligence are two different things.
Right. So there's a lot there that you just discussed and unpacked, which is that with ADHD, I actually almost wonder if clinicians should be allowed to diagnose that without actually giving tests. And the problem I have, and then a second problem, is there are certain psychologists and also well-meaning social workers and therapists who are diagnosing it with, quote, tests, but they're not comprehensive tests. They're not differentiating what the weaknesses are and what the strengths are. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's becoming almost a junk diagnosis that just leads right to medication management. And I do agree. The attention spans are going down for multiple reasons. We have phones blinking at us every 5 seconds. There was a study that came out that said that the average person's IQ was inhibited when the phone was in 6 feet of them. Because the mind. I saw that study. Oh, you did? Yeah. So the mind is like, I even think right now I should move my phone further away and it's face down, right? Because technically, like, your brain sees it as an animated object because it's got so much going on. You've spent so much time on it. And like, that's part of it is like, it's not like a piece of paper over here that I could ignore. It's like something that's going to chirp at me. It's going to make noise. And so people are on their phones. They're constantly getting messages, especially the younger people. They haven't had maybe what I grew up without cell phone until I was 22, 23. They haven't ever had those sustained times without communication.
Right.
And besides school, maybe, right? Or so because a lot of schools will take away the phones. So there's a lot of intermingling variables, I think, that are contributing to ADHD. And also, quite frankly, I wonder if it could actually be creating ADHD, right? If you're a little kid and you're growing up in a house that's completely chaotic and there's all these things, it pretty much looks like ADHD. I'm not really sure what that is, but you're distracted. You can't pay attention. Versus what I see you doing is you're saying, follow the science. And the science is this. Let's determine what the areas are. What are the deficits in this particular client? So auditory visual tests and the quotients, response control, comprehension, persistence, sensory motor, fine motor. There's a lot of these little different things where you can see for instance, one of these children was a phenomenal verbal and auditory learner, but she could not for the life of her write anything down. Right. So it was like some sort of possible, maybe a little bit dyslexia or whatever. So I think I feel like your book is a start, hopefully, of a harbinger of change when approaching ADHD, especially at the peak moment of ADHD that I've witnessed, because it was always popular whenever you had a kid that was, I don't know, not able to pay attention, easily distracted, whatever. They tried to label me with ADHD. I probably have it. I mean, whatever. I mean, as a kid, but I was on the honor roll. I got great grades all through college, high school, grad school, middle school, but I had some comprehension issues sometimes, I think, with certain assignments when they first were given to me, right? I would have to read them a few times, and then I would, oh, okay, now I've got it, and I would dig in. So it was like kind of a delayed processor, and I've never been fully tested, so I don't know. But I think what's happening is then if I'm a little kid and I get labeled that, like you said, it's a trauma to have a diagnosis. Like if you get cancer, that's a trauma, right? It could be a trauma or an adverse experience. But for a kid, we're now labeling you. You're already struggling in school. Now we've labeled you that you have this disorder. And the issue with the ADHD and like every other mental condition is it's observable, but it's not really provable with blood. You can't diagnose it with blood, but you can see it. So how does a kid not only overcome the ADHD symptoms, but get to the point where they are not identifying with it? And I think that burden, the identity thing, lies with the parents and the teachers and the professionals to not label them publicly, but to say, here's the deficits. What are they? Here's the issue. Clinicians all around the United States don't have access to your tools or don't know about your tools that you're utilizing. So there's like ADHD. Well, I guess take their phone away and make them read every night. I don't know. What do you do? So how can we speak to that? Because this, and then we'll get into the details of your book. We're going macro for a second, then we want to go micro. But how do you speak to this issue that I think is pervasively affecting all of our schools and kids right now?
Oh, it absolutely is pervasive, and that's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm here with you, and why I'm speaking, why I wrote the book, because we're headed in the wrong direction, and we can do better. And that's the key. We have solutions now to ADHD. This is not a lifelong sentence that people have felt they're subscribed to forever, that there's nothing that can be done. And the pushback on that's kind of interesting. It's like, what do you mean you can solve ADHD? You know, people struggle with that concept a little bit, but just what if we can? So what if we stop calling it something and just look at what the basic fundamental nuts and bolts are? What's really going on here? That's my background. I come from rehabilitation counseling of over 35 years. We look at people's strengths, we look at their limitations, we find the workarounds to the limitation. And that's what this is. Let's find out what's going on. Let's play to the strengths, which is why this assessment is so helpful for teachers and parents, is that while the child happens to be going through the neurofeedback that we can do remotely or in person, we can work with people wherever they are. We can also give parents and teachers the tips and techniques. So if we can identify, that's why I put those cases in the book, these case studies. So let's look at, what happened with one child. Well, this one child had some of this and some of that, and this is what was working. She was having horrific meltdowns because she couldn't process what was being said to her. So let's switch it up. We've got some children that have really strong auditory and no visual processing. We have children with no auditory and visual, vice versa, back and forth, and a combination of both. And so if you know what you're dealing with, there's a free brief assessment up on my website that people can kind of, just do the initial big toe in to kind of see, okay, am I dealing with something? And then in the book, there's an auditory chapter and a visual chapter, and there are long checklists there. So people can go through those checklists. And this is what I've accumulated in the way of data over the past 15 years of working with people. It's like, let's peel back the labels, let's peel back what we think we know, and let's just dive into what the data can show us. And then through the intake assessment that I do, but the personal one-on-one that I do, I get the story. It's like, what's the life story here that's happening? And so here's where the richness comes from the parents while the child's doing the assessment is I'm talking with the parents and I have certain questions I ask. And it's like, well, how does it work when you tell him to, get his backpack in the morning and tie his shoes and brush his teeth and then take care of the dog? And you turn around and what's going on? Well, he's playing with the dog. And it's like, yeah, he's playing with the dog and the rest of it didn't quite get done, right? It's like, oh, yeah, that's every day, all day long. And then what happens is we get the assessment in, and I'm going over this with the parents. The child doesn't have good auditory recall. And so it's like, here's the problem. And sometimes the language that comes out in this assessment report is almost verbatim to what the parents have just told me about their child. And they'll say, well, for the first time, this feels like this fits my child and describes my child. And it's like, it's kind of a good news, a bittersweet news here. We do have findings, which is a little bittersweet, I suppose. But the good news is we can find, when we find it, there's something we can do about it. And that's the key. It's really focused on what can we do about these challenges so that we can help your child thrive and grow. And the same applies to adults, by the way. So I've worked with adults. One woman who was in a call center and she was failing. She was a veteran and we were working with her and they were just about ready to let her go. And she came to me and we did this. And it's like, you don't have any auditory sequencing memory. This is about the worst job you could possibly be in for how your brain processes information. And I had a gentleman similarly was on track to lose a job and came in and he said he can't ever remember what his boss was telling him and he was getting ready to get fired yet again. And we did this, ran it, found that he didn't have any auditory memory per se. And I gave this information to him and he broke down in tears because he said for the first time he didn't think it was stupid. And it was like, you're not, but this is what's going on and here's what we can do about it. And these are life-changing events for people. And the good news about this is when we get the brain strengthened up, it's just like repetition on anything that we've learned how to do, from riding, walking, doing anything, being on a bike, anything, we've had to practice it. And so it's just a matter of capitalizing on what the brain does well, which is repetition and learning. And so let's just set up training plans that are tailored specific to the person, have them do about 20 hours of this. And what happens with that with most people is we've been able to wire in those changes in the neuronal pathways of the brain, and they don't need to keep coming back because the brain has learned how to do this. And the more you use it, the stronger it gets. So it's kind of like learning how to ride a bike when you're a kid. You can get on the bike, you can learn how to do it. You can 30 years later get back on the bike and you're probably still going to be able to ride it because it's been wired in. Your brain learned how to do it.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing is you're doing these assessments with the neurofeedback computer. And what is it? I can't remember what it's called. It's in one of the last chapters. IVA2 assessment?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What does that stand for?
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's the Integrated Visual and Auditory Continuous Performance Test.
Yes.
And so we've been using this for about 15, 16 years. It's been out for much longer than that. It's been reliably studied. We license it from the developer and use that in conjunction with their software training programs. So we're able to dial in on what isn't working and what is working, but we focus on what isn't strong and build the training plan around that are really low impact video games. They're beyond the Pac-Man version, but they're nothing like the Call of Duty versions of these high impact video games. So this isn't going to dump dopamine into your brain as other programs will do.
So some neurofeedback I've heard of is just like training people to relax. And so the movie or the video game continues when they relax and they learn to relax and sort of meditate. Is this software targeting specifically visual and auditory and different things like that? And I was just curious how it does that.
Mm-hmm. The system that we use does, there are many types of neurofeedback out there as there are fruits at the fruit market stand. So you kind of have to do a little bit of your research. There are some that work better than others. I lucked into this because I was at a university setting. My colleagues had already kind of filtered through most of the programs that were out there and had been using this one at that school district. So I kind of didn't have to do the trial and error process with that. So we went straight into the programs that seem to have the most benefit for people. And it's a lot different than some of the others where you can improve attention by watching a movie and keeping the screen on, but you're not necessarily tackling these auditory and visual processing challenges that come along with a lot of the diagnoses and that actually exist underneath a lot of these other DSM-5 categories. So, we just know it works. We've been doing it for a long time, and the results really, the proof's in the pudding, so to speak, because when people leave, we have the data. So we do the assessment at the front end. We do it after every 10 hours, which is 20 sessions. We do 30-minute sessions, usually twice a week. And after 10 hours of training, we come back and rerun those assessments so that people have data. What's really hard sometimes is that the brain changes subtly through this process. And with that, as a person, you yourself might not realize the room's getting brighter if it's a slow turn on with the light bulb. But you might feel a little bit better. And then some days it's like, I think I'm seeing a little bit better in this room. But you might not necessarily know how far you've come because it's really hard to remember where you started, particularly on something that you're not really capable of having a comparison and contrast to. The way we know things is that we know light because we know dark. And if I've always had static in my brain, such as hyperactivity, I don't know what it's like to not have that. But when we get rid of it, you might have some awareness, but along the way, you might not notice it a lot. Adults will sometimes say, a wife will say, my husband can't remember anything. I call him on the way home from work. I needed to pick up some things at the grocery store. He comes in, it's got the bread, not the milk, kind of thing. And it leads to a lot of frustrations in these families. And so the workaround for that is text him while he's coming through our program and see if that helps, which of course it does if he's got visual processing. If he doesn't, that's not going to help. But then at the end of the training, the wife will say, oh my gosh, I gave him 5 things on the way home. He brought them all home for the first time. I'm so grateful because this is where people live day to day. They live in the world where these challenges are surfacing all the time.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And I was looking at some of the results in the visual processing problem chapter where you had this client whose name has been changed, but their name was Zoe in the book. And they had like the worst score on a visual and their auditory. It was so bad it wasn't even showing up. Right. And their auditory was actually quite well. But after so many months, then you did follow-up studies with them, took the test. After 4 months after no treatment, scores were still very high. And 20 months after no treatment, scores were maybe a couple points down, but still really well done. And so, the nervous system and the brain, are tied together. And what's affecting the nervous system, everything, biology, environment, emotions, perceptions, all of these things. So I could see that somebody goes out in the world and maybe if they're prone to some sort of disorder or some sort of issue, it could bring their scores down again. But the comparison was like this. Her score was 0 and it went up to 120. And then it sort of trickled down to the low hundreds after a while. But that's a new baseline. And so what's interesting to me, and I think this strikes me as slightly countercultural because I think we like to have a label and we like to have a quick solution. Medications are a quick solution to ADHD, but the long-term side effects of some of these medications, especially the stimulants, have yet to be fully studied, and we don't think they're good. Partly cardiovascular, brain concerns, other things like that. Again, these studies are inconclusive because we have only had these medications out and people on them for so long. But this training the brain slowly with neurofeedback, specifically, this is specific neurofeedback. So I think we need to be pointing to that. This is not just a neurofeedback app you downloaded off of Apple. Okay.
Right.
And you are hooked up to this somehow. Can you explain this for people that don't know what this is?
Yeah, so when I go out and do presentations, I sometimes will take a headset out with me and I'll show them how easy it is because we're just measuring brain waves. In the clinic, we use clip-on sensors and sensors that we use a little tacky wax, it's called a 1020 paste, just to hold it in place. So there's nothing being administered to the person's brain, which is what some people are really concerned about. It's like, are you sending, electrical charges to my brain or to my child's brain? It's like, absolutely not. This is very much on par with an EKG. So you go to your doctor, you get an EKG, they'll put a little tab sensor, on you that you peel off later. This is very similar to that. It's a sensor. And these sensors are just measuring your brain waves. And yes, we can measure them through your skull. That's the amazing thing. Just like we can measure through your skin and bones, kind of what's going on inside your chest with your heart with an EKG. We can measure the brain waves. This has been done, actually, it was Dr. Barry Sturman out of UCLA in the 1970s who actually really kind of was the founder of this. So it's been around for a very long time at this point, and there's just a ton of research on it. But the sensors are simply reading, it feeds those EKG or EEG units into the computer. And because there's an algorithm running, there's these software programs that are pulling that data in. As I'm focused and attentive, if I'm really trying to pay attention, trying to train my auditory attention, as I'm focused and concentrating on this and allowing my brain to learn how to do this, then I'm going to win the game because it's reading the brainwaves. And what the feedback is giving me encouragement that I'm heading in the right direction with my brain. You can't think your way through this. Children are a lot easier to do this with than adults because adults want to sit here and try and analyze it and pick it apart. And, what do I need to be doing? It's like, just relax is all you need to do. Your brain's going to figure this out. Your brain's going to figure it out. Just allow your brain to do it. We have to actually do more coaching sometimes with our adults than we do the kids because of that. But it's reading brainwaves, and you train your brain through repetition. And as you get stronger, the games will ratchet up because you're going to get tougher so that you're strengthening the muscles in your brain, so to speak, the same as if you were going to a gym. So we kind of joke that you're coming to your brain gym sessions twice a week, and through the repetition of that, your brain learns to reinforce it. I tell people it's also why those bad habits are hard to break is because they've been reinforced. So that bag of chips that's sitting there that you're wanting to eat all the time, that's because your brain's been trained to want that. And so to change that up, you have to work at it. And this makes it a little more targeted. It's harder for people to really affect change with auditory and visual processing. We can kind of help people relearn how to do anxiety. Trauma is a hard thing for people to undo when that amygdala system gets hardwired in. So that's a little more difficult for people to manually do. This is the kind of override for when the manual systems aren't really providing the changes that we need. And it's what I call a tech hack for your brain. So you can really tech hack your way through to an improved life, and you can do it in about 20 hours. And what's not good about all of that?
Sounds great. So if people are not in where you're at, I believe you're in California. Can't remember that part of the book. I was reading more about the ADHD, but where you're at, if they're not there, could they get, like, you could mail them a headset and you could do this over the computer and some of it?
So yes, we do remote neurofeedback. And so they have to lease the equipment. And then the licenses are single-use licenses so that we can work with them. We do it the same as if they're in. There's a little more of a front load because we have to lease. There's a lease agreement and there's shipping and there's equipment and all of that, and a security deposit because I've had one or two people not send those units back. So now there's a security deposit in there for the rest of our folks that you get back once we get the unit back and it's in good working order. So we do that, and then I do the assessment on the front end before we go that route. Because we do a tech check just to make sure people's technology is up to snuff on what we're going to need to make that work. Sometimes people have to upgrade an operating system here and there. But oftentimes people are quite able to make all of that happen, and it works pretty well. We've been doing that for 2.5 years now. And it's the same process. You're still working with our clinicians and technicians, the same as if you were in the clinic. You have your scheduled appointment time. The only difference is we teach you how to put those sensors on and in the right location. And so then we do the impedance check, the same as if you were sitting in the clinic. So we teach you how to do that part. The rest of it we run the same as if you were in our clinic. And it works the same.
And so can you also take the test that way as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
So we start with that initial intake. And that initial intake will get us started on knowing whether or not this is going to be a pretty decent match for a person to move forward. We do this on children, essentially 5. Our youngest has been 3. And then our oldest person's been 93. So we really cover the gamut. I've worked with people of every decade of age that exists. I haven't worked with anyone over 100 years yet of age. But who knows? We might get our first centenarian.
Right. Oh, that's wonderful. And so really your approach is pretty straightforward. Mm-hmm. You figure out what the deficits are, you target the neurofeedback with that, and then after so long you reassess. And in every case that you've talked about, the scores go up and people subtly or significantly notice the changes over time. Mm-hmm. Now, I guess that is interesting because it's actually like you almost doesn't matter if it is ADHD or not. That's not really what you're after here. It's more about just the improvement of strengthening the parts of the brain that need strengthening. And then I would say as a clinician, I'm assuming, like, for instance, if you have a client who has auditory visual issues and probably, let's just say he's got all 3 and ADHD, and the parents constantly have 24-hour news on in the living room, there's some chaos going on about where to go and who's going where. Would you also maybe make some recommendations environmentally on top of the neurofeedback to maybe give the parents some ideas about maybe not having the TV on all day, all night? I mean, anything like that?
Absolutely. So that happens in the initial intake before we do the assessment, or while the child's in the assessment piece. I'm working with parents to really find out what's the living situation. Mm-hmm. And if they say, oh, we can't do this, you can't concentrate at home. It's like, well, what? Kind of tell me what the setting is. And, oh, well, we do it at the kitchen table, and we've got 3 other kids and a dog. And, my husband likes to have the sports game on all the time. It's like, well, that's a lot going on. And so when we get the data, and if, in fact, this is an auditory processing situation, that opens the door for a conversation then. It's like this particular measure, one of them is called auditory vigilance, and it's a distractibility measure. There's also an impulsivity distractibility. And one of those measures really nails it for parents, which is when we find this weakness in what we call the prudence score. What this means is that for people who have this, every sound that's coming at them, the brain receives at the same level of significance as anything else. And so what that means is that if the TV's on, the dog's barking, the kids around them are talking, the phones are ringing, all of this stuff is going on, all of that comes in. And then you're giving your child instructions on how to do a math problem, completely lost. Mm-hmm. It's not, and you're not paying attention. It's like, the brain can't pay attention in the setting. So the setting has to change to support the child's learning while we're going through and correcting these other areas and strengthening them. The same in the classroom. Classrooms can be pretty disruptive. And so parents will often say, well, when we're home, he can do a lot better than when he's in school. And it's like, well, let's take a look at what's happening in the classroom. So there's 30 other kids in the classroom. And if you have this, pen on a paper, just, the lawnmower going by outside, whatever it is that's going on, you've got 30 people in a classroom. No one's sitting perfectly still. People are moving around, shifting in their chairs, shuffling their feet. Air conditioning's running. The teacher's at the front of the room. Dogs outside are barking. This kid doesn't have a chance of hanging on to what's being said. Impossible for this person who has this difficulty.
Right. And in your book, you discuss that checklists for different possible auditory processing issues, like distracted in noisy places, difficulty staying on task, trouble understanding verbal math problems, difficulty remembering spoken information. There's like 20 of these. I was just like pointing that out, that you're trying to differentiate between what's going on and what's not. And it's interesting. I was curious, have you ever run into people that actually do better in loud areas? They can focus better than when it's quiet. Is that a phenomenon?
It is for some people who have a certain kind of auditory processing. So they'll have to have headphones on
Mm-hmm.
to play music in order for them to concentrate, but they could be in a household that's noisy.
Right.
So this could be a way to kind of control the noise, and so that
Mm.
they can do better because it's a song maybe they know, so their brain can kind of latch onto that,
Mm.
and then they can concentrate a little bit better. When we tackle that, sometimes that can just diminish because it's a coping strategy that people have figured out in order to be able to survive. People are trying
Right.
to survive. They're trying to do well. And so sometimes we're actually going to see these stamina scores that we measure through the roof. And so for children and adults who have a very high stamina score, it's often because they have these other really low scores. And so the brain has created a workaround, but these brains are exhausted all the time. We had one little boy who would just fall asleep in his plate of food at dinner time, literally, because he was so exhausted because his brain just wasn't working well and he was worn out. And
Mm.
so when we tackled that, it made a big difference in his life too.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense completely. Um, so you also cover in here ideas about how the brain learns, the practical tips for parents, why punishment doesn't work for attention problems. Hopefully people have learned that, but I mean,
Yeah,
there's still, you
a
think
lot of
you
room
can,
for that yet.
you think you can be aggressive with a kid and that's somehow going to change their behavior.
Yeah.
It
Mm.
doesn't. Yeah. So, yeah, I wanted to maybe ask you, I don't know, are your clinics going to, is this software company that you think is good, or the clinics, are they spreading to more areas, or what is the situation?
Mm. Well, I think neurofeedback is gaining a lot of traction
Mm-hmm.
because people are absolutely looking for alternatives to these traditional approaches, which I dub, more the medication and behavioral interventions. Because when we go that route and it doesn't work, people have to find something else. And so they're naturally looking. I think people in today's world are a lot more inquisitive than maybe they were 10 years ago. I've been doing it for over 15 years. And I have seen a big uptick. I see a big uptick in people hitting my website these days looking for other resources. And when parents call or when adults call, it's because other things haven't worked. And they're hoping for something different that can actually tackle these difficulties that they're experiencing.
Yes, absolutely. And in the book, you also covered neurotransmitters, just kind of educating people on the baseline: acetylcholine, noradrenaline, serotonin, dopamine, and other ones as well. But you were talking just about how, like, for dopamine, it's involved in multiple brain functioning areas like cognitive inhibition, inhibitionary control, self control, working memory, cognitive flexibility. So there's obviously things that people may need to balance, like they may need to go to a nutritionist and find out if what they're eating, should they be taking omega-3 supplements, things like that could also play a role in this
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
while you're doing the straight ahead neurofeedback. And, a little bit of behaviorism, what are the coping skills you can do at home? But the idea is that if you train the brain enough, you may not need so many other fixes that you're throwing at the wall, hoping they're going to fix, because it's kind of like with trauma therapy. A lot of people are in therapy for years where they don't address the trauma. They're just addressing all the effects of the trauma, all these bad things that are happening to me now, these patterns. And when you address the trauma through some type of empirically proven mind-body therapy or something like that directly, often people get the relief that they haven't got from years of talking about all the problems because of the trauma, right? And so it's like the same idea with the ADHD. It's like, okay, well, we've got I wish they could do this. I hope the kid could do this. And we've given them these meditations to do. And meditations, can help people with ADHD, right? But it may not be fixing the auditory or visual issue or whatever deficit their brain or their inhibition, right? And so I think all of those solutions are great, right? But I think this sounds like you've really, with data, been able to prove that the neurofeedback, specific neurofeedback. That's what I wanted to point out, because when I told people about your book, they were kind of like, well, everyone can do neurofeedback. You could just go get an app and buy a headset for like the Muse. But I looked at the Muse, and the Muse, no offense to the Muse, but it's mostly to get you to relax. It's not really, it's more like a meditation assisted neurofeedback. We've got to be very specific about what the neurofeedback is, bringing in clinicians to that to help you. So I'm curious, because I see a lot of data, a lot of charts in this book, your book here, but are you going to work on any university studies to kind of push this through to maybe get some more traction?
Well, there have been a lot of those already done. So I did a lot of that when I was still at the university. So I published, it's not maybe in the book, I think they're referenced in the back a little bit, but I published on ADHD in my work with children back in 2018. And I published on using neurofeedback with trauma with veterans. And I published that in 2017 in some international journals.
Oh, so here they are. So the part that I didn't read, the appendix, they're all there. Okay, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. It gives me a chance to tell people it's out there.
Tell us. Because I think this is huge.
It is huge. So, and that actually came first. So the veterans came first, the children came second in my publications. And then once we went into the pandemic situation and got the remote neurofeedback business, it was like, I can go out and talk about this now, because you don't have to live within 20 or 30 minutes of my clinics to be able to access this if you want our services. There are a lot of ways you can go out there. It's absolutely true. You do have to kind of figure out what you're purchasing, though, because I can do an app on my phone and it might help me relax. It's not going to tackle my auditory memory problems if I don't even know I have that problem. And that's the difficulty with all of this, is that most people know something's off. They want to improve it. But until you know what you're doing, you're just taking a big swipe at it, throwing a dart on the wall and hope that you're hitting something. And so these programs are great from certain standpoints. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. However, if you really want, true lasting results, you have to find the root cause of what's going on. And if it's auditory and visual processing problems that are affecting your memory, concentration, attention, and focus, you can do a lot of things yourself, but there are some times that you need a little support, a little something extra to really be able to get it over the line. And that's why I call it a tech hack, because we can do 20 hours of this, roughly, give or take, and affect change. Generally, if people are participating in a regular manner, I have to qualify some of this, because you come once a month, it's not going to work, just like going to the gym. But if you are really consistent with this and really pay attention to how this process works and how we coach people to go through it, by and large, most people get good results. So, that's kind of the key here.
It sounds like the consistency is very important, and the duration and the ability to actually do it uninterrupted. So what would you say average, this is just a general thing. So if somebody did 20 sessions, would they be doing them like 2 or 3 times a week? What would your sort of...
For us.
For you.
They're 30-minute sessions with us. So what we did, again, when I started this at the university, I was running an assessment institute, and we founded this. I founded it at the university. And so in the beginning, we kind of worked with that. It's like, well, if we do 20 minutes, if we do 30 minutes, if we do 45 minutes, if we do an hour, kind of what's the most optimal. That was in the year that we didn't charge people, because we were simply wanting to study it. I just wanted to know, okay, what is the optimal way that we can work with? Who can we work with? So I just, put it out to our community in the region and just called people and called veterans and said, hey, we've got this going on. We feel like it could help you. We're not going to charge you if you want to come in, because we're really looking at establishing protocols, the best operating processes that we can do. What's the maximum that a person can do. We found that you need at least a day in between. We found the 30-minute sessions work most optimally because at some point you're at a point of diminishing return because your brain's tired. And so
there needs to recovery day.
Yes, just like going to the gym, there needs to be some recovery time in there.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we worked with veterans who were 2.5 hours each way away from my clinic. We had some help from a local VA organization. And so they were covering the veterans' mileage to get into us. But making people drive 5 hours twice a week was a lot. So once we got them kind of stabilized, we moved them to 45-minute sessions. And we will do that with people kind of in their second round if they need it and they've moved and still want to do it in person. We can do that, but I keep that at a very case-by-case basis. People still are testing out okay. They're assessing out okay with that. I just think it's a lot to ask people to do 45-minute sessions because we know that we're kind of at the edge there. But if they've trained their brain for the first 10 hours of that, some people might be able to do that. Children, not so much, but some adults were able to do a little bit of that with on a case-by-case situation.
So it sounds like ideally you do a half-hour session, like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday sort of thing, where you have a break in between, and then you do that for X number of weeks till you get to about 20 sessions, and then you kind of reassess at that point.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, well,
and then we build a new plan. Yeah, so
that's not too bad. That sounds like very doable. I mean, considering, no offense to everyone, streaming apps, movies, computer games, social media. I think a lot of people do watch TV shows or YouTube or whatever for so long. So, I mean, we could shift that to what you're up to, and that could make a big impact. So I feel like one of the best things I like about this is the results, but also the accessibility piece that you've been able to do with having this intervention be able to be done over the distance instead of just being out there in California. Getting close to the end of the interview, but I'm curious here, have you ever lobbied with insurance companies for this sort of treatment?
We're making a tiny little bit of progress out here in California.
Okay.
With insurance companies. To me, it shouldn't be a hard sell.
No,
because this has been around for 50 years, and most of these medications haven't been around for 5. And, they're paying for the medications, but for something that gets at the root cause, to me, it's kind of a disconnect here with what's happening with these insurance companies. So we're seeing a little bit of movement in that. I will say that the VA is on board with this. I have a VA contract. So the VA out here is sending their veterans to us for neurofeedback for their diagnosed conditions. I also do psychotherapy with them. So we can do both or one or the other. And the VA has used neurofeedback for a very long time. When I first started this, there was a person who worked with one of the military institutions. I'm not going to name a state or a location because they asked me not to, but they had treated over 500 veterans with neurofeedback, but they had a gag order on them. They couldn't tell anyone they were doing it.
Okay, yeah. So then if we keep going in this round, we're going to go into the cultural bias that's happening all over with different types of treatment.
Right.
Based on when you were trained and where you were trained and how much you've read and who you've read and what you value. So, and that, I guess that's the unfortunate thing, but we do have to push especially with the science backing you up, that this is not a fly by night, get rich quick, app you made. Okay. This is like seriously boring software that tracks you and tries to figure out what's going wrong to fix that specific issue. It's kind of like physical therapy. I know physical therapy is a very effective tool, but I know it is not sexy or fun and entertaining in any way that you could think of. I think that perhaps, people are excited about yoga and things like that, but it's a hard sell, right? And to be fair, therapy is a hard sell in some ways. Let's say not ADHD related therapy, like EMDR, PTSD therapies, family therapy, couples therapy. These are hard sells because they are work, right? I'm sure if we could give couples a drug where they would just love each other all the time, and forgive all their problems, that drug would make billions. But as we know, it takes hard work to learn to communicate from two different minds. Right. So that being said, I really admire your work, and I'm excited for people to be able to check out the book. I mean, the book was, to me, it was just like, wow, you put this in language I could understand and read rapidly. I mean, I read this book in 2 weeks. It was not a hard read at all. And I was, except for the appendix, I didn't read that part. That's my joke. Sorry. That's a bring around. I just was like, I just didn't read the appendix, but whatever. It's there if you need it, if you want to be convinced. I was already convinced. And so I'm throwing that out there for folks too, because I feel like, this book is like, I don't know how much it costs because I got a free copy, but like at the most it's got to be like $15 or something.
$20.
Oh yeah, inflation. Well, so we could, you could just buy this for a family member of yours that is having these issues so they can investigate what approaches are out there, right? Mm-hmm. And your website has all sorts of free information on it. Is that how people get to your clinics? Are your clinics named? What are they named? If they're out there,
you can go on my website, which is under my name, Connie McReynolds. So okay. I'll spell it out because it's for your listeners. Yeah. So it's ConnieMcReynolds.com. Okay. And the link is up there for the book, which is on Amazon. And so there's the paperback, there's the ebook, and then I did the audiobook as well. And for the audiobook, if you buy through Amazon, there's a code you can put in to get the download for the graphs and, the pieces that you need, that if you're listening to it, some of it may not make as much sense until you can look at those graphs and kind of see what I'm talking about. It's hard to describe scores on a graph. So I just gave people the visual on that. But all three of those, and I did the audiobook myself, so it's in my voice. And then there's a free brief assessment. You can just click on that, enter your email. We'll send you the free brief assessment. And then if you sign up for the newsletter, which I promise I will not pummel you in your email with lots of that, but you can get the first 3 chapters of my book for free to see if this kind of resonates with you. And so we send out newsletters maybe once or twice a month, not very often. And just some tips, like the last one was screen time tips for summer about keeping the kids off the cell phones, getting them outside, doing other things, and kind of some guidance on really too much screen time and dealing with that.
Right. So, well, and the Surgeon General looks like they're poised to put a social media warning on social media in the next year or so. We'll see how that goes.
Well, I kind of am, based on what I've seen, I think parents need some help in making decisions about this. I think this was something that was unfurled on the population, eons ago, that now those developers that did that, they actually have left tech. They've created their own group of trying to navigate the damages that this has caused unwittingly, because we really didn't know what we were unfurling at the time. And we now know there's enough data. I've got some of the data in my book about gaming and
I did read
what goes on about addictions. We've treated children with severe addictions that have caused families a lot of grief just because they didn't know what was happening and they didn't know how to get out of it then.
Yeah.
So it's real.
Oh, yeah. And I see that because it's like what you're doing as a child is programming your brain right now. I mean, that's your learning time. And if you're learning to play games and for hours and hours and hours, which, they are so sophisticated, they will keep your attention.
Oh, they're designed to do this. They're designed to do dopamine dumps. They're designed to keep people engaged in this. And I recently did an interview, I think, on one of the major TV stations talking about the screen time. And children under the age of 2 should have 0 screen time. I've had infants holding cell phones in my reception area. And infants 0 to 2 should never have any access to any kind of a 2-dimensional device. Children 2 to 5 should have no more than an hour a day. Less is better. And just for your listeners, it's going to probably shock a lot of parents, but in children 6 and over should be 1-to-1, 1 hour of screen time, 1 hour of other activities.
I agree completely with that. I think because you've got screens, you can always learn to play with the screen or interact with the screen. It's not difficult. It's actually made easy. And it's not going to ruin your career if you don't hang out on TikTok. Okay.
Right.
You can learn some things on TikTok, but again, it's a dosing issue. So if you think about like what our bodies do all day, children's bodies need to be moving. All of our bodies need to be moving, quite frankly, as we know, they've called sitting is the new smoking, right? We're not stretching. We're not moving around how our bodies are meant to move, to burn the calories, to, there's so many things. I'm not going to go into that. I'm not a full physician, but it's obvious here that we are in a bit of an imbalance. And so all of these things can help your kids. Like, especially, you don't want your kids to be addicted to video games. It's a real thing. It's a real thing. It's in your book. Thing. The data is here. The research has been done. It's still being done because of the dopamine rush. And it is more stimulating than almost any other form of media. So small doses. But yes, I think this is we just previewed that part of the book that people should check out because, there's a lot of video game apologists out there, and it's fair. These video games can be fun. They're entertaining. You can learn something from them. Great. Your kid can have a better, some kids have improved visual, spatial recognition, but at what cost, right? So, again, if it's an hour a day, it might not be a big cost, but if it's hours and hours and hours, and that's their social life, that's a whole other topic.
Exactly. And the difficulty is, yes, it's training certain aspects of the brain, but what we know is there is some very big deficits in what it doesn't train, which is conflict resolution, interpersonal skill development, understanding nuances of communication. The list goes on because these are not being developed. So we're not building personal resilience. We're not building this sense of self-empowerment. It's the things that those games are building are very specific, and part of it is dopamine rush. And so for people who kind of tend on somewhere on the ADHD world, some of them do have low dopamine. And what feels really great is that this is where they get success. So if you've got attention and processing problems and you're not succeeding in school, but you can play your video game at night and feel good about yourself, guess what's going to be rewarding?
The video game. Yeah.
Yeah. And you want more and more and more of that because that's the only place you feel good. Because that's the only place you're succeeding. And so when we tackle these auditory and visual processing problems and they start getting more success in their day-to-day living, there's less need to try and get it from the video game, which is an empty place to get it.
Yeah. Very well said. Well, and that's part of the environmental factors that can lead to issues. So I think that's great. I'm going to put your book link and your website in the show notes so people can click on that. And I really appreciate your time. Is there anything out there you want to say to parents or family members who are worried about somebody in their family with ADHD or other issues?
That there's hope for this. We work with people all over. And I think that really figuring out the underlying causal factor is your first step. And we can do that pretty easily to get those answers for you. I've got a contact form up on my website, so people can just fill that out. If it's a phone call or something, I'll call you personally. We'll do 15, 20 minutes. There's no charge for that. I just want to try and help people. If you're out of the country or you're away, I do Zoom calls as well. So we'll just set that up and, usually talking through 15, 20 minutes, we can kind of figure out what might be going on as a way of getting something scheduled to dig deeper into it. And then we go from there. And so it's solvable. There are solutions here. And I just want people to know that. That's why I published the book. There's a way through this to a very brighter future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Connie. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician Podcast. If you are enjoying the show, please leave us a rating on iTunes or share the show with people you know. I would surely appreciate it. As some of you know, I am passionate about preventing future violence in the United States. I have started a nonprofit with colleagues called the National Violence Prevention Hotline, which is a 501c3 organization. We are endeavoring to gain funding and collaborators and volunteers so that we can start a 24/7 hotline and chat line to reach potential perpetrators before they may act violently. It is a bold effort to curb violence and save innocent lives by working to connect with potential offenders while they are in the planning stages of violence, help to de-escalate them, and provide resources so that they can get appropriate professional help. The National Violence Prevention Hotline is looking to open up a conversation about violence in society, the causes, and the solutions. You can learn more by visiting our website at violencepreventionhotline.org. You can get involved by writing your congressperson from our website, sharing it with your network, or even donating to the cause. If you are looking for an EMDR, International Association consultant, I am a consultant and I can help provide 20 hours that you need to become EMDRIA certified. Just check out the show notes and send me a message and see if we're a good fit to work together. If you are in need of counseling, do not hesitate to make an appointment with a local counselor in your area. You can also make an appointment with the excellent clinicians at Health for Life Counseling in Grand Rapids as part of the Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting www.healthforlifegr.com. And if you are in the state of Michigan, you can also schedule a telehealth appointment. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guest, and while these are based upon the literature they have read and the experience in their respective fields, the information on this podcast should not be viewed or thought of as the definitive opinion on any subject. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you're in a crisis, please call 911 or the National Crisis Line at 988. Support your local bookstore by shopping at bookshop.org. That's www.bookshop.org. It donates a percentage of sales to local bookstores all across the United States, which I think gives character to our cities and a place to hang out and a place to explore. You can order from the comfort of your own home online while supporting businesses near you. If you are a therapist and you are not involved in your local counseling or therapist or social work organization, please get involved to at least pay dues so that we can have lobbyists help keep mental health care accessible at the government level, and also expanding into schools and other places that need it. And also, if you didn't know, counseling organizations and professional organizations are working to keep us from becoming gig workers for a lot of large corporations who are coming in and trying to buy up local counseling agencies or basically pay you what they pay for people to deliver food to your house. So, get involved. Until next time on The Intentional Clinician, I wish you all a safe and peaceful week.